December 6, 1944. The forests of eastern France lay silent under a blanket of fresh snow, temperatures hovering just below freezing. Private First Class James Carter, 19 years old, crouched behind a snow-covered embankment, his fingers numb despite his wool gloves, watching smoke rise from what remained of a farmhouse 200 meters ahead. The cold penetrated through every layer of clothing he wore, the standard wool uniform, the field jacket, even the additional sweater his mother had somehow managed to send him despite wartime rationing. His breath came in visible clouds that hung in the still air for seconds before dissipating. Behind him, the rest of his squad was spread out in defensive positions, each man focused on their assigned sector, each man dealing with the same bone-deep cold that made every movement feel sluggish and difficult. Carter had been born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1925, the third of 5 children in a family that had always emphasized education and hard work, despite the severe limitations placed on black Americans in the Deep South. His father worked at the steel mills, long shifts in dangerous conditions that left him exhausted but provided enough income to keep the family fed and housed. His mother cleaned houses for white families in the wealthier neighborhoods, coming home each evening with stories about the casual luxuries she witnessed, stories that highlighted the vast gulf between different worlds that existed within the same city. Growing up in Birmingham had taught Carter certain lessons about how the world worked, about where he was expected to fit within the established order, about the consequences of stepping outside carefully defined boundaries. But his parents had also taught him that those boundaries were artificial constructs, maintained through custom and force rather than any natural law. They had encouraged him to pursue education, to develop skills, to prepare for a future they hoped would be different from the present they endured. When the military had implemented limited integration policies, when opportunities for black soldiers to serve in combat roles rather than just support positions had slowly expanded, Carter's father had encouraged him to volunteer. The military might not be perfect, his father had said on the day Carter left for basic training, but it is one place where competence can matter more than color. If you prove yourself, if you earn respect through skill and courage, some men will recognize that. Not all, maybe not even most, but some. And that is more than you will find in most places right now. Those words echoed in Carter's mind as he crouched in the snow, watching that distant farmhouse, preparing for whatever came next. He believed this would be like the training exercises back in Georgia, maybe with a bit more noise and cold. He was wrong in ways that would reshape not just his own understanding of conflict, but eventually influence tactical training for an entire generation of soldiers. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened in those next 6 hours would transform a frightened teenager with a jammed weapon into an unlikely innovator whose discovery would save dozens of lives and reveal truths about human ingenuity under pressure that no manual could ever teach. James Carter had arrived in France only 3 weeks earlier, one of approximately 16,000 replacement soldiers sent to reinforce units that had sustained significant losses during the autumn campaigns. The journey itself had been an education in the scale of the military operation unfolding across Europe. He had sailed from New York aboard a converted luxury liner, the ship now painted battleship gray and packed with soldiers, where wealthy passengers had once strolled decks and enjoyed elaborate meals. The crossing had taken 11 days of rough Atlantic seas that left most men seasick, 11 days of close quarters that forced interactions across lines that might never have been crossed in civilian life. 11 days of anticipation mixed with dread as they approached a continent torn by years of conflict. Landing at Le Havre, Carter had witnessed the massive logistics apparatus that supported the Allied advance. The port was a constant motion of ships unloading, trucks moving supplies inland, trains carrying materiel to forward depots. He saw mountains of supplies, crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, pallets of rations, all the mundane necessities that modern mechanized warfare consumed in staggering quantities. The scale was overwhelming, a demonstration of industrial capacity that dwarfed anything he had imagined during training. From Le Havre, Carter and several hundred other replacement soldiers had been transported by truck convoy. to a replacement depot approximately 50 kilometers from the front lines. They spent 5 days there, waiting for assignment, cleaning and maintaining equipment, attending briefings about the tactical situation, and trying not to think too hard about what awaited them. The veteran soldiers who rotated through the depot for rest, soldiers with haunted eyes and thousand-yard stares, offered contradictory advice. Some said to keep your head down and follow orders exactly. Others said regulations would get you killed, and field experience mattered more than manual procedures. A few said nothing at all, retreating into whatever mental spaces they had constructed to deal with what they had experienced. Carter was assigned to Company Baker 2nd Battalion, a unit that had already rotated through 3 different combat zones since landing in Normandy that summer. The company had started with 190 men in June. By the time Carter joined them in late November, only 63 remained from the original roster. The rest either casualties or transferred due to injury. The attrition rate spoke to the grinding nature of the campaign, the constant low-level erosion that modern conflict inflicted, even during periods that did not involve major battles. When Carter reported to Company Baker, he was greeted by a company clerk, a thin soldier with round spectacles who barely looked up from his paperwork as he processed the new arrival. The clerk assigned him to 2nd Platoon, 3rd Squad, handed him a mimeographed sheet with the names and positions of his squad mates, and pointed toward a cluster of tents where the unit was bivouacked. "Welcome to Baker Company," the clerk said in a tone that suggested he had repeated those words hundreds of times. "Try not to get yourself hit in the first week. We have a pool going on how long replacements last, and I bet on you making it at least 10 days. It was meant as dark humor, the kind of gallows wit that helped soldiers cope with stress and danger, but Carter found it more unsettling than amusing. He collected his gear and walked toward the tents, trying to project more confidence than he felt, trying not to reveal how overwhelmed he was by everything he had experienced since leaving home. Carter stood out in ways that made him both visible and vulnerable. He was one of only 7 black soldiers, in a company that remained predominantly white, despite the military's evolving integration policies. The policies themselves were complex and often contradictory, products of political compromises that tried to balance military necessity against deeply ingrained societal prejudices. Some units were making genuine efforts toward integration. Others maintained segregation through informal mechanisms, even when official policies suggested otherwise. Company Baker fell somewhere in the middle, technically integrated, but with social dynamics that reflected the tensions and uncertainties of that transition. The other men in his squad, Corporal Mike Patterson, Private Danny Morrison, Private First Class Lou Hendricks, Specialist Tom Bradley, and Sergeant Frank Riley, their squad leader, had initially regarded him with the mixture of curiosity and caution that characterized most such encounters in 1944. Patterson, the corporal and second in command, was a methodical soldier from Pennsylvania who had worked as a machinist before the conflict. He approached military service with the same systematic precision he had applied to his civilian work, following procedures carefully, maintaining his equipment meticulously, and expecting others to meet similar standards. Morrison was younger, barely 20, a farm boy from Iowa with a friendly openness that made him popular with the other soldiers. Hendricks was the oldest in the squad besides Riley, a former factory worker from Detroit who had volunteered despite having a wife and 2 young children at home. Bradley was the squad's designated marksman, a quiet man from Montana who claimed he had grown up hunting and could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 meters. And then there was Sergeant Riley, the squad leader, a man whose authority came not from volume or intimidation, but from competence earned through experience. Riley had landed at Normandy on D-Day +3, had fought through the hedgerows of France during that brutal summer, had earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star through actions he refused to discuss in detail. He led through example rather than orders, demonstrating what needed to be done rather than just describing it, and his men followed him because they trusted his judgment and knew he would not waste their lives carelessly. These 5 men would be Carter's closest companions for the immediate future, the people on whom his survival would depend and who would depend on him in turn. Their initial interactions had been polite but distant. marked by the awkwardness that came when people were unsure of appropriate boundaries and behaviors, but 3 weeks of shared misery, the kind that came from sleeping in frozen ditches and eating cold rations, while enemy artillery occasionally reminded them of their mortality, had begun to erode some of those barriers. They had learned that Carter could carry his share of the load, that he did not complain more than anyone else, that he kept his equipment clean and his weapon ready. These were the fundamental currencies of respect in an infantry squad, and Carter had been accumulating them steadily, one small interaction at a time. The mission that morning had seemed straightforward during the briefing. The briefing itself took place at 0500 hours before dawn, in the ruins of a barn that Company Baker was using as a temporary command post. Captain Robert Morrison, their company commander, stood before a map tacked to a piece of plywood propped against a damaged wall, using a flashlight to illuminate the terrain as he explained the plan. Morrison was a 32-year-old veteran from Pennsylvania who had led men since the North African campaign, first as a platoon leader and now as company commander. He had the lean, weathered look of someone who had spent years outdoors in difficult conditions, and he spoke with the casual authority of a man who had learned leadership through experience rather than just training. Intelligence reports suggested that the German forces in the area had withdrawn to positions further east, leaving behind only scattered defensive positions to slow any advance. Company Baker was to move forward approximately 3 kilometers, secure a series of farmhouses along a ridgeline, and establish observation posts to monitor enemy movement in the valley below. The operation was designated as a reconnaissance in force, which meant they were expected to probe enemy positions, develop the situation, and report back rather than engaging in sustained combat. "We need to keep pressure on them," Morrison had told his assembled platoon leaders and squad leaders that morning, his breath forming clouds in the cold air of the ruined barn. "Intelligence says they are pulling back to regroup. If we let them establish new defensive lines without contest, we will pay for it with blood when we have to push them out later. Move fast, stay alert, and we will be drinking hot coffee by nightfall." The platoon leaders, 3 lieutenants who stood near Morrison studying the map, asked questions about artillery support, about evacuation procedures if the unit took casualties, about coordination with adjacent units. Morrison answered each question with specifics, demonstrating the detailed planning that had gone into the operation, even though the mission itself seemed relatively simple. The squad leaders, including Riley, listened carefully, mentally translating the overall plan into the specific tasks their squads would need to execute. Carter had listened to this briefing along with the other squad leaders, Riley having brought him along as part of his ongoing effort to train Carter for leadership responsibilities, trying to absorb every detail, trying not to think about how many things could go wrong. The briefing covered friendly positions, expected enemy strength, communication procedures, contingency plans for various scenarios. It was thorough and professional, the kind of planning that the American military excelled at, the application of systematic process to complex problems. But Carter had already learned that plans rarely survived contact with actual conditions, that the neat diagrams on maps had a way of becoming chaotic and confusing when translated to real terrain with real enemies shooting real bullets. He carried an M1 Garand rifle, the standard-issue weapon that had served American soldiers reliably throughout the conflict. The Garand was a remarkable piece of engineering, a semi-automatic rifle that gave individual soldiers firepower previously available only through bolt-action weapons that required manual cycling between shots. It weighed approximately 4.3 kilograms empty, nearly 5 kilograms when loaded with its 8-round end-block clip. The rifle was 43.6 inches long, fired a .30 caliber cartridge that could reach out to effective ranges of approximately 400 meters, and could maintain a rate of fire of roughly 40 to 50 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained operator. Carter had qualified as an expert marksman during training, consistently scoring in the top tier during qualification tests that required hitting targets at ranges from 100 to 500 meters. One of the few achievements that had earned him grudging respect from the men who might otherwise have viewed him primarily through the lens of his skin color. Marksmanship was an objective measure. Either you hit the target or you did not, and Carter's targets consistently showed tight groupings that testified to his skill and practice. The Garand had become familiar to him through countless hours on the range, the weight balanced in his hands, the sight picture automatically aligning when he brought the weapon to his shoulder, the trigger brake crisp and predictable, the recoil manageable through proper technique. The advance began at 0700 hours, just as the first grey light of dawn was beginning to seep into the eastern sky. The snow had stopped falling during the night, but the sky remained overcast, a ceiling of grey clouds that seemed to press down on the landscape like a physical weight. The temperature had dropped overnight to approximately -5 degrees Celsius, cold enough that breath formed visible clouds, and metal equipment felt like it could freeze to exposed skin if contact was maintained too long. The company moved in a dispersed formation, 3 platoons advancing in a staggered line with roughly 50 meters between each squad, the spacing designed to prevent a single burst of enemy fire from engaging multiple units simultaneously. Carter moved with his squad through the snow-covered forest, his boots crunching through the frozen crust with each step, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the winter quiet. The forest itself was a mix of deciduous trees that had lost their leaves and evergreens, still showing dark green against the white landscape. Visibility varied depending on the density of the trees, sometimes opening to 100 meters or more, sometimes closing down to 30 meters, where undergrowth and terrain features blocked sightlines. The squad maintained tactical spacing, each man keeping visual contact with the soldiers to his front and rear, but spreading out enough that they did not bunch up into easy targets. Sergeant Riley moved at the front of the formation, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead, reading the landscape for signs of danger. Behind him came Bradley, the squad's designated marksman, then Carter, then Morrison, with Patterson and Hendricks bringing up the rear. The formation allowed Riley to spot threats first, while keeping the squad's best shots in position to engage quickly if contact occurred. Every 50 meters or so, Riley would raise his hand in a fist, the signal to halt, and the squad would freeze in place while he studied something that had caught his attention, a trail in the snow, a disturbance in the vegetation, shadows that might or might not conceal enemy positions. For the first hour, nothing happened. They covered nearly 2 kilometers without encountering resistance, the only sounds their own movement, and the occasional call of winter birds that had not migrated south. They passed through abandoned German positions that showed signs of hasty withdrawal, ammunition crates left partially empty, wooden boxes with Cyrillic markings indicating they had been captured from Soviet forces and redistributed, a destroyed vehicle still smoking, a half-track that had taken a direct hit from something large, artillery perhaps, the interior gutted by fire, the metal twisted and blackened. Personal items scattered in the snow, a helmet with a carefully painted insignia, a torn photograph showing a young woman smiling at the camera, a single boot that raised questions about the fate of its former owner. These remnants painted a picture of an enemy that had indeed retreated, but Carter noticed details that troubled him, details that suggested the withdrawal was not as chaotic as it might first appear. The positions were not just abandoned, they were deliberately arranged. Firing lanes had been carefully cleared, branches cut and removed to provide unobstructed fields of fire along likely approach routes. Range markers, small stones painted white and positioned at precise intervals, indicated that the German soldiers had carefully calculated distances to various points in the terrain, preparing for engagements at specific ranges. This was not the chaotic abandonment of a routed force, but the calculated withdrawal of soldiers who understood their business and who knew they might need to return, or who had prepared positions for follow-on forces to occupy. Sergeant Riley noticed it too. Carter watched as the sergeant, a lean man of 40, with a face weathered by 3 years of combat and by the decades of outdoor work he had done before the conflict, knelt beside one of the range markers and studied the surrounding terrain with the careful attention of someone who understood that missed details could prove fatal. The sergeant's eyes, a pale blue that seemed colorless in the winter light, scanned the ridgeline ahead before settling on Carter with an expression that combined concern and calculation. "Something feels wrong," Riley said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, pitched so that only the closest soldiers could hear. The tone was conversational, but the content was serious. "Keep your head down and your eyes open. If this is a trap, it is a patient one, the kind that waits for you to commit before it closes." The squad leaders passed the warning down their respective lines, and Carter saw the other soldiers adjust their posture and movement, weapons coming up slightly, eyes scanning more intensely, every man suddenly more alert to the possibility of danger. They continued forward, but now every man moved with heightened awareness, weapons ready, eyes constantly scanning potential threat points, bodies tensed with anticipation of violence that might erupt at any moment. The easy rhythm of movement they had maintained during the first hour was replaced by a more cautious, deliberate pace that reflected the increased tension. The farmhouse appeared at approximately 0930 hours, sitting atop a gentle rise with a clear view of the surrounding terrain. It was a typical Alsatian structure, stone walls with a steep roof designed to shed snow, a barn attached to one side, and what had once been a small orchard now reduced to skeletal trees surrounding the property. Smoke rose from the ruins of what had been the roof, suggesting recent artillery fire. But the walls appeared intact. Captain Morrison ordered 1st Platoon to secure the farmhouse, while 2nd and 3rd Platoons established a perimeter. Carter's squad was part of 2nd Platoon, assigned to dig in along the eastern approach, where the ground sloped down toward the valley. They had barely begun scraping away snow to create firing positions when the first shots rang out. The sound of Mauser rifles was distinctive, a sharp crack that differed from the heavier report of the Garand. The shots came from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated ambush that had waited for the American forces to commit to their positions. Within seconds, the morning erupted into chaos. Men dove for cover, shouting warnings, returning fire at muzzle flashes that appeared from tree lines and stone walls, and positions that had seemed empty moments before. Carter found himself pressed against the cold earth behind a low stone wall that bordered what had once been a garden, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Corporal Patterson was to his left, already firing controlled bursts toward a tree line approximately 150 meters distant. Private Morrison was somewhere to his right, though Carter could not see him through the snow that had begun falling again, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. "Contact east," someone shouted. "Multiple positions, they are dug in deep." Carter raised his Garand and searched for targets. The training had emphasized fire discipline, aimed shots rather than wild spraying, but in the confusion of actual combat, with bullets cracking overhead and impacting the stone wall with sharp reports that sent chips of rock flying, it was difficult to think clearly. He saw movement near a cluster of trees and fired 3 quick shots, the Garand bucking against his shoulder with familiar recoil. Whether he hit anything was impossible to tell. The engagement continued for approximately 20 minutes, a brutal exchange of fire that accomplished little except to confirm what Sergeant Riley had suspected. This was not a lightly held position. The German forces had established a defensive network of mutually supporting positions, each one carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire. Every time the American soldiers tried to advance or even move to better positions, they were immediately engaged from multiple directions. Carter went through his first clip of 8 rounds, the empty clip ejecting with its distinctive ping. He reloaded, his fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline, and continued firing at targets that appeared and disappeared in the swirling snow. He was reaching for his 3rd clip when it happened. The Garand jammed. It was not a common malfunction. The Garand was renowned for reliability. But combat conditions, extreme cold, the accumulation of snow and dirt, these factors could create problems even in the best equipment. Carter had pulled the trigger, and instead of the expected shot and recoil, there was only a dull click. The rifle had failed to fire. For a moment, Carter froze, staring at the weapon as if it had personally betrayed him. In training, they had drilled malfunction procedures: tap, rack, assess. Tap the magazine to ensure it was seated properly, rack the bolt to clear any obstruction and chamber a new round. Assess whether the problem was solved. But the Garand did not have a detachable magazine to tap, and in the moment of panic, with bullets still cracking overhead and his squadmates firing around him, Carter's mind went blank. His hands moved automatically, following drill instructor commands that had been burned into muscle memory through endless repetition. He worked the bolt, trying to clear whatever was preventing the rifle from firing. The bolt was stuck. He pulled harder, using both hands, and felt it give slightly but not fully cycle. Something was wedged in the action, preventing the mechanism from functioning. Carter dropped behind the wall completely, his heart now racing with a different kind of fear. A jammed weapon in combat was not just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. He was effectively unarmed, useless to his squad, a liability that could get others hurt if they tried to protect him. His fingers fumbled with the rifle, trying to remember the detailed stripping procedures they had learned during basic training, procedures that now seemed impossibly complex. "Hey, Carter!" Corporal Patterson shouted from his left. "You hit? Weapon is jammed," Carter called back, hating how his voice cracked slightly, trying to clear it. "Stay down," Patterson responded. "We got you covered." But Carter knew they could not cover him indefinitely. The squad was already outnumbered, already pinned down by superior positions. Every rifle mattered. He needed to get his weapon working. He needed to contribute. He needed to not be the weak link that broke under pressure. He examined the rifle more carefully, forcing himself to slow down and think despite the chaos around him. The bolt was partially open, stuck approximately halfway through its cycle. He could see the brass casing of the unfired round, wedged at an angle that prevented either full extraction or chambering. The cold had likely caused a slight contraction in the metal components, just enough to create binding intolerances that would normally work perfectly. Carter tried pulling the bolt again, but it would not budge. He tried pushing it forward, thinking perhaps he could force the round to chamber, but that did not work either. Panic began to creep in around the edges of his concentration. What was he supposed to do? How did you fix something like this when the manual procedures did not work? Then, almost by accident, he discovered something. While wrestling with the bolt, his hand slipped and the rifle tilted at an angle, approximately 45 degrees. The bolt, which had been stubbornly stuck when the rifle was horizontal, suddenly moved a fraction of an inch. Carter froze, hardly daring to believe what he had felt. He deliberately tilted the rifle again to the same angle and pulled the bolt. It moved, not smoothly, not easily, but it moved. The angle changed the binding points, allowed gravity to assist in ways that a horizontal position did not. Carter tilted the rifle further, almost vertical now, and worked the bolt with careful, controlled pressure. The stuck casing popped free, falling into the snow with a soft sound that Carter barely heard over the ongoing firefight. He had cleared the jam. But more than that, he had discovered something unexpected. When he cycled the bolt while holding the rifle at that steep angle, the action was smoother than it had been even before the jam. The cold, contracted metal seemed to bind less when gravity helped align the components. It was a tiny difference, almost imperceptible, but real. Carter reloaded quickly, his confidence returning. He brought the rifle up and immediately acquired a target, a German soldier, who was moving between positions approximately 120 meters away. Carter fired. The Garand functioned perfectly. The target went down. Whether from Carter's shot or someone else's was impossible to determine, but the weapon was working again, and that was what mattered. Over the next hour, the firefight continued to intensify. The German defensive positions were more extensive than anyone had anticipated, at least 8 separate nests arranged in a semicircle that covered all approaches to the farmhouse. Captain Morrison called for artillery support, but the response came back negative. The weather had grounded air observation, and without accurate coordinates, there was too much risk of hitting friendly positions. They were on their own. It was during this hour that Carter noticed something else. Other soldiers in his squad were experiencing weapon malfunctions. The extreme cold was affecting everyone's equipment. Private Morrison's rifle jammed twice. Specialist Bradley's weapon failed to extract a spent casing, and he had to manually clear it while under fire. Corporal Patterson's Garand developed a problem where it would only fire every other round, the bolt not fully cycling due to what was likely frozen lubricant. Each time Carter saw men struggle with the same horizontal clearing procedures he had initially tried. Each time, he saw the frustration and fear as soldiers realized their weapon was not functioning. And each time he remembered the tilted angle that had saved his own weapon. Carter worked his way over to where Private Morrison was struggling with his jammed rifle, keeping low to avoid the incoming fire. Morrison, a stocky farm boy from Iowa with red hair and a sunburned face despite the winter weather, was swearing steadily as he tried to force his bolt open. "Tilt it," Carter said, sliding up beside him. "Tilt the rifle up, almost vertical, then work the bolt. Morrison looked at him like he had suggested something insane, but desperation overcame skepticism. He tilted the rifle skyward and pulled the bolt. The stuck casing ejected smoothly. Morrison's eyes widened. "How did you know that would work?" Morrison asked. "My weapon jammed earlier," Carter explained. "Found it by accident. The angle helps with the cold." Morrison reloaded and was back in action within seconds. He nodded at Carter, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, then returned his attention to the fight. But he also passed the information to the soldier next to him, who passed it on, and within minutes, the improvised technique was spreading through the squad. Sergeant Riley noticed the change. He had been moving along the line, checking on his men, when he saw 3 separate soldiers using the tilted clearing method within the span of a minute. He worked his way to where Carter was positioned and dropped down beside him. "That your idea, the vertical clearing?" Riley asked. "Yes, Sergeant," Carter replied. "Found it works better in the cold." Riley studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Smart thinking. Keep doing what you are doing." It was a small acknowledgement, but it mattered. It mattered because Riley was a man whose approval was earned through competence, not given freely. It mattered because in that moment, Carter was not being judged by his skin color, but by his contribution to the squad's survival. It mattered because competence and innovation were the currencies that truly counted when lives hung in the balance. The engagement dragged on into the afternoon. The German positions proved stubborn, well-supplied, and expertly placed. Captain Morrison realized that a frontal assault would be suicidal. Instead, he organized a more methodical approach, using suppressive fire to keep the German soldiers pinned, while small teams maneuvered to flank individual positions. Carter found himself part of one such flanking team, along with Corporal Patterson, Private Hendricks, and Specialist Bradley. Their objective was a German position in a cluster of trees, approximately 200 meters to the northeast, a nest that had been particularly effective at disrupting any American movement on the eastern approach. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. While the main body of Company Baker maintained suppressive fire, the 4-man team would use a small gully for concealment, approach to within 50 meters, then assault the position from the flank. They moved out at 1400 hours. The snow had intensified, which provided additional concealment, but also made movement slower and more difficult. Carter found himself struggling through drifts that sometimes reached his knees, his breath coming in sharp gasps that formed clouds in the frigid air. The cold had become more than just uncomfortable, it was actively dangerous. His fingers were numb despite gloves. His face felt frozen where exposed. The rifle in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each step. The gully provided decent cover, but it was not a straight path. They had to navigate around fallen trees, climb over snow-covered boulders, and cross several open patches where they were potentially exposed to observation. Patterson led, using hand signals to communicate since voices would carry too far in the cold air. Hendricks followed, then Carter, with Bradley bringing up the rear. They covered approximately 150 meters in 20 minutes, moving slowly and carefully, freezing in place whenever firing from the main engagement seemed to shift in their direction. Carter's heart hammered steadily, a rhythm that seemed too loud, too obvious, certain to give away their position. But they reached the planned assault point without being detected. Patterson signaled a halt, and the 4 men crouched in the gully, catching their breath, preparing for the final rush. From here, they could actually see the German position. 3 soldiers in a well-constructed fighting hole reinforced with logs and packed snow, their attention focused primarily on the main American positions to the south. They had not yet noticed the flanking team. Patterson made the assault signal, a simple chopping motion. All 4 Americans rose from the gully simultaneously and rushed forward, covering the final 50 meters in a desperate sprint. The distance seemed to stretch impossibly long. Carter's legs churned through the snow, his rifle held at the ready, his entire focus on the German position ahead. The German soldiers spotted them when they were approximately 30 meters away. One shouted a warning. Weapons began to swing in their direction. The next seconds became a blur of action and reaction that moved faster than conscious thought. Patterson fired first, his shots suppressing the position. Hendricks went left, Bradley right, creating multiple angles of attack. Carter charged straight ahead, remembering his training, remembering that momentum mattered, remembering that hesitation in these moments meant death. The German soldiers attempted to reposition, to bring their weapons to bear on this unexpected threat, but the speed and coordination of the assault overwhelmed them. Within seconds, the position was overrun. Two of the German soldiers immediately signaled surrender, hands raised, their faces showing the shock of men who had thought themselves secure moments before. The third attempted to flee, but only made it a few meters before Patterson's shouted command stopped him. "Secure them," Patterson ordered, gesturing to Hendricks and Bradley. Carter checked the position for weapons and intelligence. Carter moved into the fighting hole, his hands shaking from adrenaline rather than cold now. The position was well stocked: ammunition crates, ration containers, even a small field stove that still held warmth from recent use. More importantly, there was a map case and what appeared to be a communication log. Carter grabbed both and handed them to Patterson. "Good work," Patterson said. He looked at the three prisoners, young men barely older than Carter himself, their field grey uniforms worn and dirty, their faces showing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. One of them looked directly at Carter, and for a moment their eyes met. Carter saw not an enemy, but simply another soldier, another young man far from home, caught in circumstances neither had chosen. It was a moment of recognition that transcended the labels and ideologies that had brought them to this frozen forest. The neutralization of that first position created a breakthrough. With one corner of the defensive network eliminated, Captain Morrison was able to redirect fire and maneuver against the remaining positions. Over the next 2 hours, working methodically, Company Baker reduced the German defenses one position at a time. Each assault followed a similar pattern: suppressive fire, flanking movement, swift, overwhelming violence, followed by surrender. Carter participated in the assault on 3 more positions. Each time his rifle functioned flawlessly, the tilted clearing technique having solved the cold weather reliability issues. Each time, the German soldiers surrendered rather than fight to the last, their willingness to resist eroded by the systematic elimination of their supporting positions and the realization that continued resistance meant certain death. By 1600 hours, all 8 German defensive positions had been neutralized. Company Baker had suffered 3 wounded and 1 soldier with severe frostbite requiring evacuation, but no fatalities. The German forces had sustained 2 casualties during the initial firefight and had lost 37 soldiers captured. It was, by the grim mathematics of combat, a highly successful engagement. Captain Morrison assembled his squad leaders for a debriefing in the captured farmhouse, which, despite its damaged roof, provided some shelter from the intensifying snow. Carter was surprised to be included in this gathering, normally reserved for non-commissioned officers and above, but Sergeant Riley had insisted, saying the captain needed to hear directly from the soldier who had solved the weapon malfunction problem. Morrison listened carefully as Riley explained what Carter had discovered. The captain was a methodical man, trained as an engineer before the conflict, and he immediately grasped the significance. Weapon reliability in extreme cold was an ongoing problem affecting operations across the European theater. If a simple technique could significantly improve function rates, it could save lives on a scale far beyond this single engagement. "Private Carter," Morrison said, addressing him directly, "I want you to demonstrate this clearing method to every man in the company. Sergeant Riley will organize the training. We will also submit a report through proper channels. This is exactly the kind of field innovation that needs to be disseminated throughout the division." "Yes, sir," Carter replied, trying to keep his voice steady, trying not to show how much this acknowledgement meant. The training began that evening, conducted in small groups as squads rotated off perimeter duty. Carter demonstrated the technique dozens of times, showing men how the tilted angle facilitated clearing jams and how maintaining a slight upward cant while operating the bolt could prevent malfunctions in extreme cold. Some soldiers were skeptical at first. The idea seemed too simple, too unconventional. But when they tried it themselves, when they felt how much smoother the action worked, skepticism turned to appreciation. Word of the technique spread beyond Company Baker. Within 2 days, soldiers from other companies in the battalion were seeking out Carter to learn the method. Within a week, The division quartermaster was investigating whether technical modifications to the standard lubricant specifications could complement the field technique. Within a month, training bulletins were being distributed throughout the theater, crediting Private First Class James Carter with the innovation that had improved cold-weather weapon reliability. But for Carter, the most significant changes were more personal and immediate. The respect he had earned through that one day of combat, the combination of the weapon technique and his performance during the assaults, fundamentally altered his relationship with his squad mates. He was no longer the replacement, no longer the outsider defined primarily by his race. He was Carter, the soldier who had kept his head during a crisis, who had contributed materially to their survival, who had proven himself when it mattered most. Corporal Patterson, who had initially been distant and formal in their interactions, began seeking Carter's input on tactical decisions. Private Morrison, the farm boy from Iowa, started sharing stories about his family back home, the kind of personal details soldiers only shared with those they trusted. Specialist Bradley taught Carter card games during the long, cold evenings in their bivouac. Sergeant Riley, that weathered veteran whose approval meant everything, began grooming Carter for leadership, assigning him additional responsibilities, testing his judgment, preparing him for eventual promotion. The barriers had not disappeared entirely. Prejudice did not evaporate after a single engagement, but something fundamental had shifted. Competence, courage, and innovation had created bonds that transcended the divisions society had constructed. In the mathematics of survival, where every man's life depended on the skill and reliability of those beside him, the superficial categories that mattered in civilian life became increasingly irrelevant. The winter campaign continued. Company Baker fought through dozens more engagements as the Allied forces pressed toward the German homeland. The weather worsened before it improved, temperatures dropping to -15 degrees Celsius during the coldest weeks of January. The tilted clearing technique became standard practice throughout the division, saving countless hours of weapon downtime and preventing failures during critical moments when reliability meant the difference between life and death. Carter himself was promoted to corporal in February and to sergeant by April, leading his own squad through the final months of the European campaign. The men under his command, some of them white soldiers from parts of America where he would not have been allowed to eat in the same restaurant or use the same facilities, followed his orders without hesitation because they trusted his judgment, valued his experience, and had seen him prove himself when everything was on the line. The captured map case and communication log from that first German position assault, the items Carter had retrieved during the firefight, turned out to contain valuable intelligence about defensive preparations in the region. The information helped shape operational planning for subsequent offensives and was specifically mentioned in after-action reports that went all the way to division headquarters. Carter received a Bronze Star for his actions that day, the citation noting both his tactical initiative during the flanking assault and his innovative solution to the weapon malfunction problem. But perhaps more meaningful than the medal was a conversation Carter had with Captain Morrison in late April, as the conflict in Europe was approaching its conclusion. The company had secured a small German town, another in the endless succession of objectives that marked the Allied advance, and Morrison had called Carter to the command post to discuss his plans for the future. "You have options." "Sergeant Carter," Morrison said, "the military is changing. Not fast enough maybe, but changing. Men like you who have proven themselves in combat, who have shown leadership and innovation, you are needed. I can recommend you for officer candidate school if you want to make the military a career." Carter had considered the offer carefully. He thought about the young man who had arrived in France barely 2 months earlier, frightened and uncertain, wondering if he would measure up, wondering if his skin color would forever define how others saw him. He thought about what he had learned, not just about tactics and weapons, but about the complex dynamics of respect and prejudice, about how extreme circumstances could reveal both the worst and best in human nature. "I appreciate the offer, sir," Carter had replied. "I need to think about it. I need to see what the world looks like when this is over, see if the changes are real or just temporary adaptations to necessity." Morrison had nodded, understanding the deeper question Carter was asking. "That is a fair assessment," the captain said. "Whatever you decide, You have earned the right to make that choice on your own terms. The conflict in Europe ended in May 1945. Company Baker was among the units that did not need to redeploy to the Pacific, spared that fate by the sudden conclusion of the war in August. Carter returned to the United States in October, part of the massive demobilization that saw millions of soldiers transition back to civilian life. The America he returned to was not the transformed nation he had hoped for. The respect and equality he had experienced in his integrated unit, the bonds formed through shared danger and mutual dependence, did not automatically translate to the civilian world. He faced discrimination when looking for work. He encountered the same prejudices and barriers that had existed before he left. The bronze star on his chest and the sergeant's stripes he had earned did not seem to matter in a world that still judged him first by his skin color. But Carter had changed, even if the world around him had not fully caught up. He had proven to himself that competence and character mattered more than categories. He had experienced what was possible when people were judged by their abilities rather than their appearance. He had discovered reserves of courage and innovation within himself that he had not known existed. These were truths that no amount of prejudice could erase, foundations upon which he could build a life. Carter eventually used his military benefits to attend college, one of the first in his family to do so. He studied engineering, that same systematic problem-solving approach that had helped him discover the tilted clearing technique now applied to civilian challenges. He became an educator, teaching mathematics and physics to generations of students, many of them young people who, like him, came from backgrounds where others underestimated their potential. In 1968, more than 2 decades after that frozen December morning in France, the United States Army officially incorporated modified cold-weather weapon maintenance procedures into training doctrine. Procedures that had evolved from Carter's field innovation and the subsequent technical research it had prompted. The training manual did not mention Carter by name. Such documents rarely credited individual soldiers, but those who had served with him knew the lineage of the idea. Corporal Mike Patterson, who had covered Carter during that first jam, who had witnessed the discovery and helped spread the technique, wrote to Carter when he learned about the updated training manual. The letter arrived at Carter's home in Philadelphia, forwarded through several old military addresses before finally reaching him. "Remember that day in France," Patterson wrote, "when you figured out that tilted clearing method? I was thinking about it the other day. Not just the technique itself, though, that saved plenty of rifles, and probably some lives too, but what it represented. You could have panicked when your weapon jammed. Instead, you thought, you innovated. You solved a problem that a lot of men with more experience and higher ranks had not figured out. And then you shared that solution freely, helped everyone benefit from what you had learned. That is the kind of leadership and character that the Army needed then and still needs now. I am proud to have served with you, my friend." Carter kept that letter in a drawer in his desk, pulling it out occasionally during difficult times, when the weight of ongoing struggles for equality and recognition felt overwhelming. It reminded him that change happened in small moments as well as large movements, that individual actions mattered, that the connections formed through shared experience could transcend the divisions society tried to impose. The German soldiers Carter had helped capture that day, those young men whose eyes had met his across the divide of language and nationality and ideology, they had their own stories of return and rebuilding. One of them, a soldier named Hans Müller, who had been 19 years old during that engagement, later wrote a memoir about his experiences during the conflict. In it, he described the moment of capture, the mix of fear and relief, and particularly his surprise at seeing a black American soldier among his captors. "I had been told many things about the American forces," Müller wrote in his memoir, published in German in 1973 and later translated to English. "I had been told they were disorganized, poorly trained, motivated only by material advantage rather than any higher purpose. The propaganda had painted particular pictures of different groups within the American military, pictures designed to make us feel superior, to justify our own actions. But when I was captured that day, when I looked into the face of that young soldier who was guarding us, I saw something the propaganda had never prepared me for. I saw competence. I saw discipline. I saw a man who had every reason to hate us, but who treated us with dignity. It was the beginning of my understanding that I had been lied to about many things, that the world was more complex and more human than the simple categories I had been taught. Mueller's words, written decades after the events they described, spoke to the same truth Carter had experienced from the opposite perspective. The categories that divided people, the ideologies that justified conflict, these were constructs that broke down when confronted with direct human experience. Respect earned through shared hardship, recognition of common humanity across artificial barriers, these were the forces that ultimately proved more powerful than propaganda and prejudice. The story of that December day in 1944, the day a 19-year-old soldier discovered an innovative solution to a technical problem while under fire, became something larger than a simple tale of military ingenuity. It became a parable about the nature of innovation itself, about how necessity drives discovery, about how the most valuable insights often come from unexpected sources, about how crisis reveals character. Training instructors in the decades that followed would sometimes tell versions of the story to illustrate points about adaptability and field innovation. The details would vary in the telling. Some versions emphasized the technical aspects, others the leadership elements, but the core narrative remained consistent. A young soldier, facing a critical equipment failure under combat conditions, had refused to panic. Instead, he had experimented, discovered, and shared his solution freely, improving the effectiveness of his entire unit and eventually influencing doctrine across the military. What many versions of the story omitted, or mentioned only in passing, was the context of race that had made Carter's achievement simultaneously more difficult and more significant. He had proven himself in an environment where he faced not just the obvious dangers of combat, but also the subtle and not so subtle barriers of prejudice. His innovation had forced recognition from those who might otherwise have been unwilling to acknowledge his capabilities. His character had earned respect that society at large was not yet ready to grant automatically. This omission was itself revealing, a reflection of how institutions often absorbed the contributions of marginalized individuals while remaining reluctant to fully acknowledge the extra obstacles those individuals had to overcome. The innovation was celebrated. The innovator's full story, including the context that made his success remarkable, was frequently simplified or ignored. Carter understood this dynamic. He had lived it. But he also knew that change was measured in generations, not days, that the respect he had earned in his unit, the opportunities that military service had created, the students he had taught and inspired, these were all part of a larger transformation that would continue long after he was gone. Progress was not linear. Setbacks were inevitable, but the direction was clear to anyone who compared where things stood with where they had been. In his later years, Carter occasionally spoke at schools and community organizations, sharing his experiences not as a hero seeking recognition, but as a teacher offering lessons. He talked about the importance of innovation, about how solutions to difficult problems often came from thinking differently, rather than simply following established procedures. He talked about the value of competence, about how excellence could not be denied, regardless of the prejudices people brought to any situation. He talked about leadership, about how true leaders served those they led rather than seeking glory for themselves. And he talked about that moment when his rifle had jammed, when panic had threatened to overwhelm him, when everything had seemed to be falling apart. He described it as the moment when he had to choose between being paralyzed by fear or trusting in his own ability to think and adapt. The choice he made in that instant, the decision to approach the problem systematically rather than emotionally, had shaped everything that followed. Young people, particularly those from backgrounds where society's expectations were low and obstacles were high, found inspiration in Carter's story. They saw in his example proof that their own potential was not limited by others' perceptions, that innovation and excellence could come from anyone willing to work hard and think creatively, that barriers could be overcome through competence and character. The tilted clearing technique itself eventually became obsolete as weapon designs evolved and cold-weather lubricants improved. By the time the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam rolled around, the specific method Carter had discovered was no longer necessary. But the underlying principle, the idea that field innovation mattered, that soldiers on the ground could contribute meaningfully to tactical and technical improvements, that the military should encourage and reward creative problem-solving, these ideas became embedded in training and doctrine. Carter passed away in 2003, at the age of 78, surrounded by family and friends who had known him not as a war hero, but as a husband, father, grandfather, teacher, and community leader. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned his military service and his Bronze Star, but focused primarily on his 5 decades as an educator and his work with youth organizations. It was, in many ways, the legacy he would have chosen, to be remembered not for a single day of combat, but for a lifetime of service and teaching. But among those who had served with him, among the veterans who had learned the tilted clearing technique and passed it on, among the students he had taught and inspired, among those who understood the full context of his achievements, Carter's story represented something more profound. It was a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that competence transcends the artificial categories society constructs, that crisis reveals character, and that individual actions, taken at critical moments, can ripple outward to affect far more lives than anyone might imagine. The farmhouse in eastern France where Company Baker fought that day still stands, restored after the conflict, now home to a family that knows nothing of the battle that occurred there more than half a century ago. The forests have regrown, the scars of conflict long since healed by time and nature. The snow still falls each winter, covering the landscape in white silence, creating conditions that would still challenge weapon function if anyone were testing such things. But the lessons learned that day, the innovations discovered, the barriers broken, the connections forged across divisions of race and nationality and ideology, these persist in ways both visible and invisible. They persist in military doctrine that values field innovation. They persist in integrated units that take for granted what once seemed impossible. They persist in the countless small moments when individuals choose competence over prejudice, when excellence is recognized regardless of its source, when crisis brings out the best rather than the worst in human nature. Carter's story, properly understood, is not about a single technical innovation or even a single day of combat. It is about the capacity for human beings to adapt, to innovate, to transcend their own limitations and the limitations others try to impose. It is about how excellence creates its own authority, how competence commands respect, how character matters more than category. These are timeless truths, relevant far beyond the specific circumstances of one frozen morning in December 1944. The rifle jam that could have ended in disaster instead became an opportunity. The young soldier who could have been paralyzed by fear instead discovered reserves of creativity and courage. The squad that might have remained divided by prejudice instead united around shared purpose and mutual respect. The innovation that began as a desperate improvisation eventually influenced training for thousands of soldiers, and the lessons learned in that moment of crisis continued to teach long after the immediate danger had passed. This is the power of individual action in critical moments. This is the potential that exists when barriers are removed and people are judged by their capabilities rather than their categories. This is what becomes possible when necessity drives innovation and when excellence is recognized regardless of its source. These are the truths that James Carter's story illustrates, truths that remain relevant in any time, any place, any circumstance where human beings face challenges that seem overwhelming and barriers that seem insurmountable. The technical details of the tilted clearing method, the specific mechanics of how gravity and angle combine to solve a cold weather malfunction, these are footnotes to history now. But the larger story, the human story of a young man who refused to panic, who thought creatively under pressure, who shared his discovery freely, who earned respect through competence, who broke barriers through excellence, who used his experience to teach and inspire others. This story endures because it speaks to fundamental aspects of human potential and possibility. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.